Hello everyone, my name is Alec, and I want to welcome you all to the third episode in our Hero's Journey series. Today, we will cover the first two stages of the second act in the hero's journey: tests, allies, and enemies, and the approach to the Inmost Cave. The sixth stage, Test, Allies, and Enemy, is usually the longest part of the story, or the part where we dwell the most when writing or enjoying any kind of narrative. The reason for this is that there is a lot of ground to cover. Despite the fact that the rules of the world have already been established in the Ordinary World stage, the transition from the overworld to the underworld means that we must learn about new rules, new dynamic, and new characters. Something that I didn't mention before is that this transition can be defined also in terms of the Ordinary World and the Special World. It doesn't necessarily need to be underground, although in some cases it is literally underground. Think about A Journey to the Center of the Earth or 20,000 Miles Under the Sea. Most classic works will be having this kind of structure where you have the ordinary world above and the special world underneath, and this can also be applied to other stories such as The Matrix. For example, we have the ordinary world where it's like the real world, and then you have the underworld, which is the Matrix, or it could even be the other way around depending on how you're reading the story. And this is important to keep in mind because you'll see the reference to going under the earth or into a special dimension. It can sometimes be the case, but if you're doing your story based on your own experiences like I am, then chances are that you have never been on the ground, or at least not in the traditional sense of the word. So remember that hero's journey is a flexible structure. It doesn't need to be taken literally. So this transition from the ordinary world to the underworld means that we must learn about new rules, new dynamics, and new characters. In this stage, our character has set sail on a ship, just got off a train, started the first day in a new school, or has arrived in a new city for the first time. Everything is new, daunting, and unfamiliar. The mentor, friends, and allies come into play to allow our character to learn the ropes of his new world and continue acquiring new skills that will help them make it out alive. It is also here where the first tangible obstacles are encountered. In the departure act, the struggle happened within our character or in a controlled familiar space. Here, obstacles come from without, and because the threshold is behind us, the hero needs to face them. There's no turning back. When we step into the special world, we notice a definite shift. The hero might be discombobulated by this unfamiliar reality and its new rules. This is generally one of the longest stages in the story, as our protagonist gets to grips with the new world. There is not a set number of tests that the characters must go through, although I'm guessing that if we pay attention, a rule of 3 will probably be common because that's how storytelling goes. So this will depend on the kind of story that you want to weave. The nature of these tests will also depend on the kind of story that you have. An example could be Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, where the tests can range from learning how to fly on a broom to fighting a troll. In The Hobbit, the first test that Bilbo undergoes is stealing from trolls, which ends up being a sort of preparation for him sneaking into Smaug's lair. Trolls get a rough treatment in almost any stories. I think that even in Narnia, they're not treating very well. Bilbo also gets to practice riddles and wordplay on spiders and Gollum before their showdown with Smaug, which also includes speech as a centerpiece. If your character won't end up exchanging riddles with the dragon, but instead could use other skills like swimming, beating someone at a chess match, passing an exam, or learning how to cook fajitas, then the test should focus on these areas. The same principle applies to allies and enemies. Depending on the kind of story you're telling, your allies and enemies will vary. They could be a Ranger of the North and a Dark Lord, like in The Lord of the Rings, or in Harry Potter we have Hermione and Ron and a Dark Lord. I think I need to start using different examples, but think along the lines of secondary characters, maybe allies, and the antagonist is the enemy. There are, however, many other potential enemies or obstacles. Maybe there is one huge threat, like President Snow in the Hunger Games, but there are other minor characters that are also enemies, like the other tributes or the peacekeepers. This big enemy is the main antagonist, and it's where the showdown will happen, but along the way you face other easier to beat enemies, right? In other genres, the enemies may be more abstract, like procrastination, self-doubt, or negative influences. Because in our life, we don't typically encounter Dark Lords or assassin robots. Our enemies can appear in different shapes and forms. Maybe a teacher can be an enemy, not because they are inherently a bad person, but because they can hinder our advance towards our goals through their actions. Or maybe it's that sneaky classmate that borrowed your Nintendo Switch and never gave it back. Once you have established a couple of exciting incidents or tests that your character has gone through and fleshed out a bunch of secondary characters that can help your hero, you are ready to move on to the next stage, which is the approach to the Inmost Cave. This is the first time that your hero stares into the eyes of the enemy, the big challenge or the danger zone. This isn't a physical cave. Instead, the Inmost Cave refers to the most dangerous spot in the other realm, whether that's the villain's chambers, the lair of the fearsome dragon, or the Death Star. Almost always it is where the ultimate goal of the quest is located. It may not need to be a physical cave like I mentioned, but in many classics it literally is a cave, hence the name. The hero hasn't arrived at the cave yet, but is about to enter it. Think about it as a rehearsal before the struggle begins. In your story, this will be a bit more difficult to explain and maybe just a scene or an instant in your narrative will cover the approach to the Inmost Cave. If your hero is an aspiring skateboarder, for example, this may be visiting the skate park, pondering the situation, maybe feeling a bit nervous, or any park depending on what kind of sport you're playing. Because of its association with a cave, which tend to be dark and scary, doubt and hesitance can strike the heart of your hero. Maybe they confide to one of their allies that they're not 100% ready. The main characteristic of this stage is that it helps build some tension before the next stage, the ordeal. That is when things really get going. That will have to wait until the next video though. What I will do right now is proceed with the narrative of my own journey, exemplifying these two stages. The first thing that I need to mention is the time frame of my story. I started last week by saying that I moved to Tijuana in 2017, and this story will cover up until late that year or maybe the start of 2018. I haven't worked out the entire story. The reason for this choice is because events in my life allow me to cover all stages in about 6 months. And this doesn't mean that nothing else happened afterwards. In fact, many important things have happened since. But for the sake of this series, I will limit myself to that 6-month period. Having cleared that up, let's move on. After moving to Tijuana and finding my bearings in the new city, I started making friends and a few antagonists, as well as facing new challenges. My main allies through this journey were my roommate, who I knew before the journey began, but things changed now that we started living together, a couple of friends from work, and my parents. Also, keep in mind that because this is just illustrating the process, I'm really not going to mention them again, but they're there and they're important. With the help of my mentor and my allies, I was able to face the first tests. These included a couple of job interviews, commuting for 2 hours to Tecate, where I still worked at an elementary school, and back every day, and basically just dealing with being in a different place. Additionally, a few weeks into my new life, I got both jobs that I interviewed for. Actually, I ended up having 3 jobs. And I found myself working 52 hours a week. It was crazy. Not only did I have to balance a rough schedule, but I also had to meet new students, co-workers, bosses, and learn how to do a lot of things that I had never done in my life. During this point in the story, I don't think that there were many enemies to speak of. Most of the struggles happened within me and had to do with how hard I was working, how little sleep I was getting, and the fact that I was biting off more than I could chew. I would leave my home at 6:30 in the morning and come back at 9:30 p.m. most weekdays. I also worked on Saturdays, so even Fridays were bittersweet. At first, I felt like I could handle it. I was younger than I am now. I was ambitious and almost pathologically optimistic. It was an unsustainable model, and my approach to the Inmost Cave happened on many fronts. In the physical realm, I worked at the Inmost Cave. It was a private school where I taught for graders, and I loved it. But as the stress, the long hours, and the workload began to get to me, I felt myself disconnect from the parts that brought me joy a little at a time. I approached my own Inmost Cave. I slept even worse, and I became a workaholic, doing little else than to think about or be at work. Saturday nights gave me anxiety because I would not work the following day. It was crazy. At that point in my life, it was clear that the only solution was to change, as I was not going to make it through the school year like this. I started thinking about what to change or how to face it while trying to keep grips on my mental stability when the ordeal presented itself in my life. It was a pivotal moment, as things would never be the same, and it would push me towards my goals. But it was also bitter, drenched with sorrow and grief. This, however, will need to wait until our next video, when I will talk about the ordeal and the reward. Sorry that I'm finishing it on sort of a grim note. But anyways, Thank you all for watching. Remember that sources and materials are linked in the description below, and that you can post any questions or thoughts in the comments. Have a wonderful day, and I will see you in the next class.